Back in 2012, which seems like a million years ago today, some of us, myself, Bogdan Bitvitsky, Roman Protsik, who both work at the Ukrainian Studies Fund of the US, decided that there was very little English language literature about the Donbass. And this was a time when Yanukovych was in power in Ukraine, the party Regions was trying to monopolize the country. And so we thought it would be good to have a research project about the Donbass in a very broad sense of that term. The project, three-year project initially, began in September 2013. Little did we know about how good the timing was going to be. And timing, as we know, is everything. It began in September 13, and of course, 2 months later, we have, bang, the Euromaidan. And then you have Crimea. Then you have the Donbass War. So the project ballooned and expanded beyond just a simple kind of political history of the Donbass to something far more broader to do with Russian aggression against Ukraine through the Crimea and Donbass. And of course, how this ensuing crisis, became the biggest crisis in Europe since World War II. The project eventually had to become 4 years. It finishes in August because of the fact that between about 2014, 2015, in effect, 1 year was lost. And during that period of time, I did 300 interviews for electronic and print media from every part of the world, from communist China to Japan to Latin America to the Middle East, and of course Europe and North America. So hence we had to extend it for a year. What happened during that period of time is from 2014 to the present is that people who didn't have a clue about Ukraine, who had never traveled to Ukraine, suddenly became Ukraine experts. I actually would joke that everybody became a Ukraine expert. In my book I have, which is coming out in about a week's time, it's available on Amazon, I have a very big bibliography, which is, of course, useful for academics and students in teaching, of 300 publications, academic and think tank publications. At no period of time since 1991 has there been such an explosion of writing about Ukraine and Ukraine-related items. Now, of course, a lot of this, which was written from the viewpoint of people who had never visited Ukraine, never mind the war zone. Often it was Russophile or even Putinophile, blaming the West for the crisis, that poor Russia had to react to the West kind of pushing its nose into Russia's sphere of influence. There was also, I would say, the biggest group of writing is geopolitical, by international relations experts, where Ukraine isn't really important. It's just a piece of territory that's in a sort of a contest of wills between Russia and the West. But the key thing is that I would say majority of these authors didn't know Ukraine. Often this was written by experts on Russia, who are far more prolific than experts on Ukraine. If you think about all of the centers in the West and in Canada as well, which are called something like Center for Russian and East European Studies or Center for Eurasian Studies or whatever, they're always led by Russian experts, never by Ukrainian or Georgian experts. And these are the kind of people who, maybe are not Putinophile, but they will give a Russian slant to the conflict in Ukraine. What do I mean by that? So things like they would describe it as a civil war, as an internal conflict, particularly between language speakers, between Ukrainian and Russian speakers. All complete baloney, all completely untrue, but this is the kind of image that they want to see. And of course, it's something that's continually propagated by Russia's information war. The other thing which is important to realize in this kind of explosion of publications since 2014 is that what we understand as Ukrainian studies in North America has not really taken part in the discussion, in the academic debate about the Ukrainian-Russian war. Why is that? Well, since 1991, Ukrainian studies in North America has not adapted. It's not broadened itself to include political science and international relations. Ukrainian studies today is as it's always been, language, culture, Cossacks, and the Holodomor. That's it. And there isn't really any, for example, even, forget politics, but there isn't even any Ukraine studies research and publication programs on Ukrainian nationalism in the 1940s. Try and find, as I have done when I've compiled syllabuses, articles on UN, UPA in the 1940s, which give an alternative viewpoint to the revisionists such as John Paul Himker. They don't exist. We simply have not put money into that, even that field, never mind Ukrainian politics. That, in turn, is also reflected in the fact that despite Putin putting billions of dollars into his information war against the West, Ukrainians in North America, or Ukrainian studies in North America, are not able to counter that in any way. In the whole of North America, there are only 3 people who even write op-eds on contemporary Ukraine. Adrian Keretnitsky, Alexander Motyl, and Taras Kuzio. Not a single Canadian, Ukrainian. And that's because we haven't invested money in politics. That's why it's because Ukrainian studies continues to be dominated by male historians. There's a very gender inequality here. Male historians, often over 70 of age, very old, who are hogging these positions, who don't do social media, and who have no interest in Ukrainian politics or the contemporary era. I'll just quickly say something about the book. The book is different in the sense it's a more informed opinion of this war than what you will traditionally see in these 300 publications. And that is because those publications will be unable to compete with my book because I actually took the trouble of doing many visits to eastern and southern Ukraine. In the 3 years from 2014 to 2017, I did 15 research trips, thankfully with travel money from the Ukrainian Studies Fund, and I visited all of the major cities and towns in eastern and southern Ukraine. I went twice to the war zone with volunteers from Kyiv, and this is all available in the book through interviews and through photographs. Some of the best photographs are of the incredibly patriotic Ukrainian women who are working as volunteers, both in driving to the front line and working in offices in southern and eastern Ukraine, collecting and preparing packages for soldiers on the front line. So that's one question. But the central issue, which is not really covered in Western publications and which is something that Western governments don't really want to get involved in, and that is that this war is a far more complicated war than Western governments want to believe. That's because this war is about national identity. That's what crucially this war is about. It's not about territorial conquest or anything like that. That's just a second question. Ukraine is, of course, defending its territorial integrity, but more importantly, it's defending its national identity. This war between Russia and Ukraine, and it's not an anti-terrorist operation, it's a war. It's a war that's killed 30,000 civilians and combatants in 3 years, which is 10 times more than were killed in 3 decades of terrorism in Northern Ireland. This is a war over the question of Russia being unable to accept Ukrainians are a separate people and that Ukrainians within their own borders, the people who live there, have a right to decide their own destiny where they want to be, either in the Russian world, the Ruski Mir, or in Europe. And added to that is Russia's unwillingness to accept that eastern and southern Ukraine is part of Ukraine and not part of some mythical new Russia. So until Russia overcomes that national identity question, then there will be conflict and war. And it doesn't really matter if Putin is around or not. Because this problem of Russians being unable and unwilling to accept Ukrainians as a separate people is far more deeper and broader than simply Putin. So when you scratch a liberal Russian, that Russian becomes no longer liberal when he or she talks about Ukraine. All of the Russians, whether they're Democrats, so-called, or pro-Putin, support the annexation of the Crimea. Try to find a Russian who does not support that. One of those people was Boris Nemtsov, and he was assassinated. He was one of the few Russians that didn't accept the annexation of the Crimea. Russian nationalists, which is already a term which is a misnomer, do not accept Ukrainians as separate people. Why is it the misnomer? Because they're not nationalists, they're imperialists. A nationalist desires to have his or her independent state, i.e. they are separatists. Russians were never separatists, either in the Tsarist Empire, in the Soviet Union, and today. They prefer to live in a multinational empire, not as a separate independent state. The book covers a multitude of other sins related to the conflict, questions of anti-Semitism, which is traditionally found in Russian nationalism. Of course, in the Soviet Union, it was disguised as anti-Zionism, but it's the same thing. The question of the role of organized crime in the Donbass and Crimea, and how Putin uses organized crime to promote his strategic objectives, the history of the Donbass, Party of Regions, and importantly, the last two chapters dealing with war crimes and human rights. The level of the criminality that's taken place against Ukraine soldiers and civilians is horrendous. This has not been taken up sufficiently by either the Ukrainian diaspora or by President Poroshenko. I don't believe President Poroshenko has been reluctant for Ukraine, for example, to ratify the Rome Statute, making Ukraine a full member of the International Criminal Court. And finally, national identity, because every conflict and every war impacts upon a country's national identity. We can thank Vladimir Putin for destroying the Stalinist myth of brotherly peoples. That is gone and will never come back. And so what we have is, I would call it, over 25 years or nearly 30 years now, the spreading of Ukrainian national identity into Russian-speaking eastern and southern Ukraine. Late 1980s, it was Western Ukrainian driven towards independence. Orange Revolution was Western and Central Ukraine, and now we have Eastern and Southern Ukraine coming on board. Well, I would say that of these publications, the think tank ones are okay. They tend to focus on Russian aggression, Russian military activities, like, for example, the very famous British one, Bellingcat. The think tank publications are okay. They do military analysis, and they do also analysis of Putin's cyber warfare, information warfare, and funding of far-right anti-European political forces in the EU. So they are not so bad. I think where the problem lies is more in academia. And in academia, you have, the old Sovietologists of pre-1991 became experts on Russia, and they dominate post-Soviet studies. I mean, you don't get a center for Russian, East European, or Eurasian studies which is not controlled by Russian experts. You don't get it controlled by Ukrainians or Georgians or Uzbeki experts. And because of that, just like in some ways journalists which are based in Moscow and have to cover the former USSR, they inevitably will see things through Russian eyes. I mean, they don't read the Ukrainian media, they don't know the Ukrainian language, they don't feel secure in Kyiv, they don't know who to interview. And so even on things like the selection of their footnotes and resources, that already feeds into a bias. In Kyiv, you do have some Western journalists, but they are very few and far between. They tend to be news agencies like Reuters and Associated Press. And if you're based in Moscow, you tend to read Russian media, not Ukrainian media. You don't know the Ukrainian language. You tend to look at things in a kind of a Russian way, particularly on the language question. You tend to be more dismissive of attacks on Russia, that, this is just Russophobic. And so, the bias can be in different levels. I mean, you do have extreme bias of people like Richard Sackler in Britain and the editor of The Nation, who was always on CNN for some reason in the US, Cohen. Providing a pro-Russian line is not just one angle. I mean, pro-Russianism covers a multitude of sins. It ranges from people who are completely outwardly pro-Putin, the Richard Sackler of Britain, for example, or Cohen, the editor of The Nation, for some reason always invited to CNN. There's that group, but there's also others who will provide a Russian view, I would call, of the crisis in Ukraine, but they're not necessarily pro-Putin, and they'd be very offended if you said they were pro-Putin. But they still focus too much on the language question. They too much see it as a civil war, an internal conflict. They, maybe because they're a bit left-wing, will blame the West for the crisis to some degree. They'd be willing to let Putin off the hook a bit, well, come on, he was provoked and this, that, and the other. So there are different variants of how you can have a Russian viewpoint on this. But you also have to remember that Russian people who write on Russia, people who are from Russia, who are academics, they have a long experience of writing for Western journals and publications. Ukrainian academics from Ukraine, very few of them get published in the West to this day. They don't know the English language, and so that situation which you had in the USSR even, where people based in Moscow and Leningrad, Russian academics, Academy of Sciences, universities, they knew English. I mean, they had access to Western publications. Ukrainians did not. So that provincialism still remains. I mean, the number of Ukrainian academics who get published in the West is extremely small still. And Ukrainian diaspora doesn't even try to support that. I'll give you one example. Volodymyr Vyatrovich, the head of the government-funded Institute of National Memory, is very prolific. And he writes a lot of good stuff on Ukrainian nationalism, but he doesn't know English. And his books, therefore, and articles are always in Ukrainian. Why is the diaspora and various funds not translating his work into English and getting it published in the West? This doesn't happen, but why not? So that problem means that Ukrainian academics can't really compete with Russian academics. I mean, there's a journal in this 300 publications I mentioned, there's a journal called Russian Politics and Law. And it had 3 special issues on the Ukrainian-Russian war called Crisis. 3 special issues. Do you know how many special issues of Harvard Ukrainian Studies and the CIUS journal there were on the crisis? 0. 0. In 2015, the CIUS journal did a special issue on the Holodomor. Of course, we're short of publications on the Holodomor, right? No. We have publications coming out of our ears on the Holodomor. But none of these Ukrainian studies publications published anything on the Euromaidan, on the Crimea, and on the war in Donbass. This is, I think, a far more deeper problem. In Britain, where I come from, in Canada and America, every year we commemorate Kruti. Well, I'm sorry, Kruti was a long time ago. It's 100 years ago. Donetsk Airport was a year ago. Why are we not celebrating Donetsk Airport? They held out longer than they held out at Kruti. but it's beyond our comprehension. It just happened 2 years ago. They held out for nearly a year, 250 days, against overwhelming Russian forces, not separatist forces, Russian elite Marines and paratrooper forces. They held out. I've met some of those cyborgs in Kyiv. We should be celebrating Donetsk rather than Kruty. But it's as though this conflict is something too much for us to take in, as it were, and it's beyond our comprehension. And because of that, the kind of Ukrainian viewpoint and which I would call the informed viewpoint, that this is not a civil war between Russian and Ukrainian speakers. This is a Russian aggression against Ukraine. This is a Russian-Ukrainian war. Doesn't really get out to the more broader academic and therefore policymaking community. My book hopefully will do that, and various talks and things like that will do that. But we need to rethink our approaches, and we need to have a perestroika of Ukrainian studies. There are a couple of things that are working in our favor here. The book comes out at a good time because, and I have that on the actual cover, in the writing on the front cover and the back, is that finally last year the West woke up to the fact that Russia has declared war on the West. It declared war on the West 10 years ago, exactly, in February 2007, in Putin's very well-known speech to the Munich Security Conference. At the time, the West ignored the speech, even though Putin followed up with the assassination of Litvinenko in London, the invasion of Georgia, cyber attacks against Estonia, and so on and so on and so on, until you get to Ukraine in 2014. But it took Russia cyber attack and hacking into the US presidential elections. It took all of the scandals around Trump and maybe his links to Russia. And it took also Putin's continued cyber attacks against European countries, against the European Parliament, against NATO, against the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, and also Russia's financing of far-right nationalist and fascist political forces who are against the European Union. So all of that came to a head, I would believe, in late 2016, and the West finally has woken up to the realization that Putin has long believed he is at war with the West. And that means, we have to do something to deal with this question. And despite all the criticism of Donald Trump, which is well-deserved, his point about countries not fulfilling the NATO target of 2% of GDP being spent on defense is absolutely right. You have a Russian threat that's there. Russia is out to destroy European Union, NATO, and Western democracy. Now, luckily for Ukraine, in that point of view, Ukraine's not alone, therefore, because Ukraine is part of that war that Russia is fighting against the West. In Russian eyes, Ukraine's Euromaidan leaders are agents of the West. Ukraine is a fifth column of the West in Russia's so-called zone of privileged interests. So unlike 1918, unlike in the 1940s, today Ukraine is not alone. That's very important, I think, to realize that Ukraine is the Ukrainian problem, the Ukrainian question is now part of an overall Western conflict and new Cold War with Russia. Well, probably about four things. Firstly, the incredible women of Ukraine. These are women who previously were not involved in civil society. You can find women from young to pension age, Russian speakers often, who are helping our boys. I mean, this is how they see it. And other women, the lady Natalie, who I traveled to the front line with last year twice. I mean, she goes twice a month. This is psychologically, this is a huge effort because it's a 12-hour drive down there. It's a lot of hassle collecting the stuff and then delivering it. You're on the front line. They're shooting at you. I mean, it's got bullet holes in it. So those are incredible people. And it's something that I think is unrecognized. There's not enough written and said about those women of Ukraine who are doing that help. Secondly, I would say, of course, the language question, which I've already alluded to. I think the language question is something that is difficult in both Moscow and the Ukrainian diaspora to understand. The concept of a Russian-speaking Ukrainian patriot. It shouldn't be surprising to people because, for Christ's sake, majority of Canadians speak English, but they're Canadian patriots, they're not Americans. So the idea that you can have two countries next door to each other speaking the same language but still having different national identities shouldn't be strange. Scots speak English, but they're Scots. And in this sense, thankfully, the majority of Russian speakers in Ukraine supported Kyiv. They did not support the separatists or Moscow. Thirdly, one can talk about what's interesting that came out is the religious question. Many of these Russophiles, I would say, look at religion in that part of the world and they see this as a conflict between, say, Ukrainian and Russian Orthodox, that somehow the Ukrainian Orthodox are suppressing Russian Orthodox. Again, completely untrue. And it's untrue for many reasons. One reason is that Eastern Ukraine is not very religious. When you drive around the Donbass, you don't see churches. You don't see churches in villages. It's one of the surprising things. When you drive around Western Ukraine and Central Ukraine, you see at least 2 to 3, if not 4, churches in a small village, especially in Western Ukraine. When you see churches in towns in the Donbass, they're churches created by oligarchs. It's like the churches done in Sicily by mafiosi as a sort of penance to God, as it were. So we have to, and then when you look at the geography of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which is officially called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the majority of the parishes of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine are actually in Orange Ukraine, Central and Western Ukraine. For example, Transcarpathia and Bukovina. This is not a conflict over orthodoxy. And I think that those three things are very big. I would say the final thing, which is kind of something that strikes you, is the high level of patriotism in Ukraine. Call it patriotism, nationalism, however you want to call it. It doesn't really matter. This is a country where soldiers and volunteers are willing to give their lives for their country. They're not fighting for the president. They're fighting for Ukraine. It is a place where there are very low levels of public trust in political leaders and in state institutions. This has been the case since 1991. It's nothing new. And yet, people are willing to give their lives, willing to fight. They see it as a fight for Ukraine, see it as a fight for Ukrainian territory, fight for Ukrainian national identity. And that is something that's very striking. And it's something, these kind of issues, patriotism, Ukrainians being far more religious than Russians. There is as many Orthodox parishes in Ukraine as there are in Russia, which is a country with 3 times more population. So Ukrainians are far more religious than Russians. And thirdly, the language question. All of these are issues that Putin underestimated when he attacked Ukraine. He thought Ukraine would be a cakewalk because the Russian image of Ukraine is one of an artificial country. By the way, that's a view propagated also by some Russian experts in the West, that Ukraine's a Stuchny country. It's a kind of it's artificially created. It's not really real. There are divisions, regional diversity, language question, etc. And yet they found the opposite to be true, that Ukraine wasn't a cakewalk and Putin's new Russia project completely failed. So I would say those four areas, with the women of Ukraine, the language question, religion, and high levels of patriotism, are issues that, yes, I had some inkling about, but you only get to know those issues when you go to the ground, when you go to those places and you talk and mingle with people. Because you can't read about this in textbooks or in articles. You have to actually visit and mingle with people. When I just mentioned the Donetsk airport as being the new modern Kruty, majority of those cyborgs were Russian speakers. I met some of them in Kyiv. They're tough Ukrainian patriots. They would have been willing to stand to the end. So I think Ukraine is a place that often we learn even more as we study it. That, I believe, gives book like mine, where I have experience of going out to the field, far greater, as it were, ability to prove its point, to be more informative than books. It's very easy to sit in New York or Indiana or London and write a book about the crisis, and you've never been there. But you're the big Russian expert. And the assumption being that because you're an expert on Russia, you're an expert on Ukraine. The arrogance of that already is beguiling. So that we don't think that these Russophiles and Putinophiles are very far away, they are also quite prevalent in Canada. Not really in Toronto as much, but certainly in Ottawa. At the University of Ottawa, we have Kachanovsky, who's even more extreme than John Paul Himka when it comes to Ukrainian nationalism. I even accused him at a conference in Edmonton a few years ago of actually being a Russian political technologist as opposed to an academic, because he believes in all these conspiracy theories. For example, that the people who were killed, the Heavenly Hundred who were killed on the Euromaidan, were killed by Ukrainian nationalists. It's the view propagated by Moscow. This is somebody at the University of Ottawa saying this. And then we have Dominique Carrel at the University of Ottawa, who's chair of Ukrainian studies. He's so far up the ivory tower that he obviously can't see the ground. Since 2014, he's not written a single op-ed, blog, or article. Has he been away on holiday for 3 years? Does he not realize this is important? So when we talk about Ukrainian studies not getting involved in this big explosion and this big discussion, well, let's look to Dominique Carrel. Why is he being so quiet? We have a very big, two big Putinophiles at the University of New Brunswick. Mikhail, should I call him, Molchanov. I was on once a TV debate with him, Luke and Way, and Chrystia Freeland, and I couldn't believe the kind of things he was saying, which were denying at all that there are any Russian troops in the Donbass. And we have Paul Robinson at the University of Ottawa as well, who, again, tries to pretend he's objective, but, of course, his anti-Americanism, which is often always prevalent in these Putinophiles, comes out, and therefore he's comes out in this this pro-Putin line on the crisis. Canada's equivalent of Britain's Richard Sakwa that I've mentioned is also of Polish descent. Piotr Dudkiewicz at the Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at the University or Carleton University. He also, again, it's this sort of Canadian anti-Americanism, which then translates into a very pro-Putin line on the crisis. So there we have it. We have Carleton University, Dudkiewicz, we have Molchanov, University of New Brunswick, we have Kachanovsky, Dominique Carrel at the University of Ottawa, and then we have the infamous Paul Robinson as well. So we have quite a group to deal with in Canada. Is Ukrainian studies dealing with that in Canada? I mean, is Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies doing anything about it? I don't think so. I think most academics sadly put their heads in the sand. They don't want to get into confrontation about this. Very few people want to do critical reviews, for example, of Richard Sakwa's book, or go on TV and have stormy debates with these kind of academics. And therefore, the revisionists, whether they're writing about Ukrainian nationalism or the Putinophiles talking and writing about contemporary Russian-Ukrainian relations, can get away with it because nobody's willing to take them on. That obviously is wrong. They should be taken on, and their views should be shown to be what they are, which is simply not insightful, not interesting. And in the case of many of these people, like Paul Robinson, they've never even been to Ukraine. And so all of a sudden, they're big experts on Ukraine. So it's incredible how they think that their knowledge of Russia allows them to have such a allegedly interesting and informative view of the crisis when they actually know nothing about the country. And they're not objective because their anti-Americanism gets in the way. The world has become a very bizarre place. I was interviewed by ABC, which is Australia's equivalent of CBC and the BBC, a few weeks ago, and I was really angry. It was a live interview. I was really angry that they somehow believed it was morally right to put a claim by Russia on the same level as a claim by Ukraine. That, well, actually the Russian media is saying that Ukrainian fascist battalions are the ones who started reignited the war in Avdiivka. And I'm saying, firstly, there are no volunteer battalions left. They've been all integrated. Secondly, how can you believe anything coming out of Moscow where everybody knows this is a center of lying, of deception, of disbelief? This is part of Russia's information war. Why are you believing this? And it's incredible when Australians even are looking at it like this, because this is the city, Moscow's and the regime that's been lying about the downing of MH17, on which you had a lot of Australians sat. So it's incredible. Yes, it's wrong to put on the same moral level the aggressor and then you have the Ukraine or Western side. Partly this is also the fault of, I would say, the Ukrainian leaders. Why? What is wrong with the way this war is approached is that it's continued to be called an ATO, an anti-terrorist operation. The West, Russia, and Ukraine continue to sort of mythologize that this is an anti-terrorist operation. It's not. It's a Russian-Ukrainian war. It's a Russian aggression against Ukraine. 30,000 people at the minimum have died. And so this is not a terrorist incident. Terrorism means something small-scale, short-lived, where the security service takes charge, as it would in Canada or anywhere else. But this is something far more than that. The IRA in Northern Ireland did not have a 40,000 army with tanks and surface-to-air missiles. They do in the Donbass. So if you continue to perpetuate the myth this is an ATO as opposed to a war, then you help to feed that mythology that this is a kind of an internal conflict, that Russia's not involved, that this is somehow a civil war. You have to say what it is. And I think it's, there's a growing feeling in Ukraine, growing demand, I would say, from political forces, from veterans and soldiers for President Poroshenko to come out openly and actually say what this war is about and what this war is. And that it's not simply just an anti-terrorist operation against a few terrorists. There's far more deeper than that. And then by doing that, you then can have a different approach to the outside world. You have a ridiculous situation today where Russia, the aggressor, is sitting down as Russia as the peacemaker in the Minsk negotiations. Absolutely ridiculous. As in Syria, in both eastern Ukraine and in Syria, Russia creates the problem and then wants to be the peacemaker. So it's time we told the truth, as it were, about it. I think we owe that to the Ukrainian soldiers and the volunteers on the ground.